The next morning, dressed in his green jumper and jeans, Darker scrambled into the passenger seat of his uncle's car, carefully placing his backpack at his feet. The car's a bit of a banger, I'm afraid. Uncle Max turned the key in the ignition for the 4th time. But once she's cleared her throat, she fires up like a Ferrari. On the 5th attempt, the engine roared into life and the mint green Renault 4 bunny hopped forwards. Whoops, Uncle Max chuckled. Handbrake. He released the handbrake and stamped on the clutch, grinding through the gears as he pulled out into the road. I've persuaded Eddie to let us into the vaults, he said, leaning over the steering wheel to check the road was clear before accelerating across a junction. Darkus knew Eddie from visits in the school holidays. He was the security guard on duty when Dad had disappeared. He always had a smile for Darkus and a bag of sweets in his pocket. Margaret is going to meet us and unlock the room Barty disappeared from. Uncle Max looked at Darkus. You remember Margaret? Darkus nodded. Margaret was his father's very bosomy, overly perfumed secretary. Marvellous girl, he chuckled. She used to have a bit of a thing for me when I was a younger man. Ew, Darkus grimaced. Now, we'll keep our heads down, Uncle Max continued, ignoring Darkus, because the museum, or rather Mr. Langley, the museum director, wasn't overly keen to let us have a look in those vaults. We're sneaking in. Let's just say this is not an official visit. Uncle Max grinned. But there's nothing to worry about. We archaeologists are always venturing into places uninvited. I flatter myself I'm pretty good at it. Why won't Mr. Langley let us in? Not sure, Uncle Max frowned. He waffled on about how the police having done a thorough search and the rooms being restricted access. To be honest, I stopped listening when I realised he wasn't going to say yes. Eddie and Margaret were much more helpful. They parked a couple of streets away from the museum and walked in through the main entrance, like any family on a day trip. Eddie was waiting for them beside a cafe on the ground floor. He was standing in his uniform in front of a door signposted, "No entry." "Hello, Edward, how are you?" Uncle Max asked, shaking his hand. "I'm very well, thank you, Professor." Eddie grinned at Darkus and rubbed his hand across his head. "What happened to your hair, son? Had a fight with a lawnmower?" "Hi, Eddie." Darkus smiled shyly. "Something like that, yeah." "You look like a hedgehog," Eddie said, offering him a boiled sweet from a bag in his pocket. "Thanks." Darkus took the sweet. "I mean, for doing this, letting us see the vault." "No bother, son." Eddie shook his head. "Terrible strange business. Glad to be able to help." They followed him through the door and down a flight of stairs into the belly of the building, where Bartholomew Cuttle's personal secretary, Margaret Dingle, was waiting for them. Uncle Max lifted his safari hat. "Good of you to help with this, Maggie." "Not at all, Max." Margaret blushed. "You know I'd do anything for Barty." She grabbed Darkus's shoulders. "Now, young man, I'm sure you're too old for a hug, but that's not going to stop me." She smothered him with her mauve cardigan and then grabbed his chin. "Let me look at you. How are you holding up?" "I'm fine," Darkus reassured her, untangling himself. "Uncle Max is looking after me great." "Are you feeding the child properly, Max? He looks thin. And what have you done to his hair?" "He's always been thin," Uncle Max huffed. "Now stop fussing over the poor boy and let's have a look at this room my brother magically disappeared from." "This is the one Bartholomew was in." Margaret pulled a set of keys from her handbag and walked to the third of 6 grey metal doors. "Are these rooms private?" Uncle Max asked, following her. "The collection is open to researchers and academics, but only by appointment with the director of the museum. Occasionally we'll exhibit parts of it to the public, but it's too big for one exhibition." Above the door was a wooden plaque with the words "The Cutter Coleoptera Collection" engraved in gold. Uncle Max pointed at the plaque. "Would that be Lucretia Cutter?" he asked, his face draining of colour. "Mm-hmm." Margaret nodded, unlocking the door. "She's a great patron of the museum. She sponsors the Coleoptera collection. The Natural History Museum has the largest collection in the world, and it costs a lot to take care of it." Darkus had never heard of Lucretia Cutter, but he could see from the expression on his uncle's face that she was bad news. "What does Coleoptera mean?" Darkus asked, sounding out the unfamiliar word. It means sheath-wing, Uncle Max replied. It's the Latin name for beetles, because beetles have two sets of wings, you see. The elytra, the hard protective sheathed wings, and the soft ones underneath that they are used for flying. Darkus thought back to Baxter flying at the clones and remembered his surprisingly wide see-through amber wings. You'd never guess he kept them folded away, hidden under his elytra. The new word felt like a discovered secret, and Darkus was keen to use it as soon as possible. Hang on a minute. Beetles, he said. Dad went missing in a room full of beetles. Uncle Max raised one eyebrow. Precisely so, lad. Margaret held the door open and Darkus pushed inside, desperate to see the room his father had disappeared from 5 weeks ago. The collection room was empty and bare. It had at its centre an enormous wooden table, which was clear except for an impressive microscope. Along the left and right-hand walls were floor-to-ceiling wooden cabinets, made up of hundreds of slender drawers with brass handles. There was no way out of this room other than the door behind him, and there was nothing in the room but drawers and a table. The hope he'd harboured, that he and Uncle Max would find something the police hadn't spotted, evaporated as he looked around the room. His heart sank. He couldn't help but feel disappointed. Outside the door he heard Margaret whispering to Uncle Max. Oh, Max, they're talking about advertising for a new director of science. Are they now? Uncle Max cleared his throat angrily. Well, that's going to be embarrassing when we find Barty, isn't it? He paused and lowered his voice. Don't say anything in front of the lad. No need to upset him. Darkus went rigid. He was sick of being treated like a child. Annoyed by their secrecy, he went over to one of the wooden cabinets and pulled a drawer open. His irritation changed to wonder when he saw rows and rows of dead stag beetles pinned to a white board under a pane of glass, each with a neat red label below it. He'd read his dad's beetle book from cover to cover the night before, but he would have recognised these beetles anyway because of their antler-like jaws. He opened another drawer and another. They were all full of beetles. He looked around the room again. If every one of these drawers was filled with 100 different types of beetles... His brain went blank when he tried to do the maths. There's thousands, he whispered. He slid off his backpack, unzipped it and pulled out a massive jam jar with a perforated lid. Uncle Max had said that Baxter couldn't sit on Darkus's shoulder when he was out of the house in case the beetle upset people. Darkus had complained that he wanted to take Baxter out for walks, so as a compromise, Uncle Max had found the jam jar at the back of a kitchen cupboard, and while Darkus washed it, he made perforations in the lid with a screwdriver and a hammer. Darkus placed the jar on the table now and tapped the glass. Baxter didn't move. Thinking he might not like being in the jar, Darkus unscrewed the lid and reached in and picked up the rhinoceros beetle, putting him on his shoulder. Baxter was unusually still. Even his antennae were motionless, but he didn't protest. Delving back into the backpack, Darkus pulled out his beetle book and flipped it open, turning the pages over until he reached the chapter on rhinoceros beetles. He found the Latin word he was looking for, calcosoma. He walked along the wall of drawers until he saw the word on a label below a brass handle, and he pulled out the drawer. Whoa! Darkus found he was looking down at rows and rows of black and brown rhinoceros beetles. Some were big, some small, some mottled, some plain, some with 5 horns, some with none. But one thing was obvious, Baxter was bigger than all of them. Baxter, you're a giant! Look at this one! He pushed his finger against the glass. It's like a mini version of you. Baxter hissed at him quietly and picked his way down Darkus's shoulder away from the dead beetles. What's the matter? Darkus said. But even as he spoke, he realised that for Baxter, this room was a graveyard. Uncle Max followed Margaret into the room. You brought the beetle? Uncle Max said, stopping and staring at Baxter. Darkus stepped backwards, startled by the sharpness of his uncle's voice. I... Darkus didn't want to admit he'd brought Baxter for support in case he got upset. I didn't think it would matter. He cupped his hands over Baxter. I'll put him back in his jar. I think that would be best. Uncle Max gave Margaret an apologetic look. You're not allowed to bring live animals into the collection vaults, Darkus. I didn't realise, sorry. Darkus held Baxter in his cupped hands and looked at Margaret. The police report said there were specimen trays open in this room. Are these specimen trays? He nodded at the drawer of dead rhinoceros beetles. Margaret nodded. Yeah, that's right. Some of these drawers house the beetles from Darwin's personal collection. Which ones were open? Darkus asked, taking Baxter over to the jam jar. I want to see the beetles Dad was looking at. Margaret pointed. The third column along in the middle section, you'll see 3 trays marked with blue stickers. They were open when I came down here with the police. Darkus tried to put Baxter back into his jar, but the beetle didn't seem to want to go. It kept crawling up his wrist and slipping out of his grasp. Uncle Max pulled open the top drawer labelled with a blue sticker. Darkus leant over to look and Baxter dropped onto the table. Some of the beetles are missing, Uncle Max announced. There should be a row of darkling beetles here and here. There's nothing but labels. Darkus came over to see, forgetting Baxter for a moment. Margaret frowned. That's odd. Uncle Max pulled open another blue stickered drawer. This one is completely empty, and so is this one. Perhaps the police took them away, Darkus suggested. Margaret shook her head. They didn't take any beetles. Darkus looked down at the empty drawers. And there's no glass either. You're right, Uncle Max nodded. Why might that be, Margaret? I don't know, she blinked. There should be. Her voice trembled. It's okay, Maggie. Is there anything else you can tell us about how the room looked? Uncle Max asked softly. She pointed towards the seat behind the microscope. Bartholomew's papers and coffee were there on the table next to the microscope. She bit her lip in an effort to hold back tears. The cup was still full. Darkus went and sat down on the chair, placing his hands either side of the microscope and looking into it. Nothing. He looked up just in time to see Baxter drop off the table onto the floor. He glanced up at Uncle Max, who had his arm around Margaret's shoulders, comforting her, and quickly ducked under the table. Baxter, he whispered, crawling towards the beetle. Come here. The beetle ignored him, scurrying over to a wide mesh grate 2 feet high under the cabinets. Darkus pulled his body forwards quickly and quietly. All he could hear was Margaret's muffled sobs. No, Baxter, he whispered, as the bat beetle clambered through the grate and disappeared. He scrambled onto his knees and poked his fingers through a hole in the mesh, but he couldn't reach the beetle. He pressed his cheek to the floor and tried to see what Baxter was doing. It was pitch black and the beetle was invisible in the darkness. Darkus stood up. Margaret, he said, looking up to the ceiling and around the room. She lifted her blotchy face from Uncle Max's jacket lapel. Yes? What are these grates for, by the floor? That's the climate control system. It keeps the room at the right temperature to preserve the beetles, Margaret explained between sniffs. Does it lead anywhere? Margaret looked confused. What do you mean? I mean, if you took the grate off and maybe crawled under there? No, dear. Margaret shook her head. There's a room with an air conditioning machine that keeps all the collection rooms at the right temperature, and the shaft behind those cabinets leads to that machine and delivers cooled air into this room. What are you thinking, Darkus? Uncle Max asked, moving away from Margaret and coming to look at the grates. Nothing, He didn't want his uncle to get angry about Baxter's having run away. Well, I felt the cold air on my cheek and wondered where it came from, that's all. Uncle Max stroked his chin as he looked at the grate. Good thinking, lad. And you're right, those grates are a way out of this room, but if Barty went down that air conditioning shaft, then someone would have had to force him or carry him. And that's too small a space for 2 men to crawl through, especially if one is struggling or unconscious. He sighed and returned to the puzzle of the empty specimen drawers. Darkus's pulse quickened. It hadn't occurred to him that the grates might be a way out of the collection room. He dropped back down to his knees, suddenly excited. Uncle Max was right. The gap beneath the cabinets was small, much too small for 2 men to crawl through. But it was big enough for one. If he unscrewed the grate and took it off, Darkus was sure he could wriggle through the vent. There wasn't enough space to crawl on hands and knees, but if he lay on his belly, he would be able to propel himself forward using his elbows and toes. He tugged at the grate front, and it rattled but didn't want to come off. He peered into the darkness beyond, until his eyes could make out the air conditioning shaft opposite. If Baxter didn't come back, he'd have to take the grate off and crawl after him. He unscrewed one of the grate fasteners with his fingers, wishing he'd brought Uncle Max's screwdriver, and then he spotted a solid black shadow shuffling backwards, dragging something.